Searching for a solution for northern Syria, the presidents of Turkey and Russia hold talks in Moscow to try and de-escalate the fighting in Idlib. I'm Imran Garta, and today's newsmaker is the meeting between Erdogan and Putin. Turkey and Russia back rival sides in the Syrian war. Ankara supports the opposition, while Moscow has propped up the Assad regime. In the past week, the two sides have come the closest yet to direct conflict. A Syrian regime airstrike in Idlib last Thursday killed more than 30 Turkish soldiers. Turkey responded with Operation Spring Shield and has neutralized more than 3,000 regime soldiers. Today, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin are holding urgent talks in the Russian capital to try and reach a ceasefire. Turkey and Russia have come to the negotiating table before. Well, in 2017, along with Iran, which, like Russia, also supports Damascus, the first of the Astana talks began. Those meetings eventually led to the creation of 4 de-escalation zones in Syria. Only one remains, Idlib. In 2018, Presidents Erdogan and Putin were face-to-face for more talks, this time in Sochi. They brokered a truce and agreed to set up a demilitarized zone in Idlib to protect civilians. But like agreements before, it hasn't held. An increasing fighting there, the last rebel-held enclave, has triggered yet another humanitarian crisis. These Moscow talks are an opportunity to ease those tensions. Here's what the two leaders said ahead of the meeting.
The situation has escalated in Syria, and this will be a topic of our discussions today. At the beginning of the meeting, I'd like to offer my condolences for the deaths of your soldiers in Syria. Deaths are always a big loss. Unfortunately, as I've said before on the phone, no one, Syria included, knew about the location of those soldiers. And at the same time, unfortunately, Syrian soldiers suffered as well. And there are big losses in the Syrian army. That's why we must discuss the situation, because we don't want this to happen again.
We are together today because of the negotiations over Idlib, and this meeting has a great importance. We see a lot of problems in the region, and I know that the entire world is watching us right now. The decisions that we'll take here today will ease tensions in the region and in our home countries.
Well, to discuss what's at stake, I'm joined now here in the studio by Emre Ersen. He is an associate professor of international relations at Marmara University and an expert on Turkey-Russia relations. In London is former Kremlin advisor Alexander Nekrassov. Bassam Barabandi is in Washington, D.C. He's a former Syrian diplomat and the co-founder of Syrian opposition group People Demand Change. And also in the U.S. Capitol is Mark Simakovsky. He's a former chief of staff in the Europe and NATO office at the U.S. Defense Department and has advised the U.S. government on Russia. Gentlemen, good to have you all on the program. Now, just a little bit of housekeeping. We are expecting a press conference to be held by both leaders after their meeting. It could happen during our discussion here. It could happen afterwards. If it does happen, we'll dip in and listen and come back for some analysis. But we got enough of a taste, Emre Ersen, from the beginning to know that it's not two nations that look like they're going to war with each other. It looks like two leaders who are keen on de-escalating. Is that fair?
Exactly. I think the de-escalation is the key word here, and the last few weeks have been quite tough for Turkish-Russian relations. And most of the time we actually focus on Syria when we speak about contemporary Turkish-Russian relations, but we need to take a look at the bigger picture as well. And these two countries have significant economic links, and in addition, their strategic partnership, which has become stronger in the last few years, is also quite important. So they don't really want to sacrifice all these things just because of the situation in Idlib. Yes, it is true that the situation in Idlib and in Syria in general is very complicated, and the positions of the two sides are largely irreconcilable. But nevertheless, I think why they're here, why they are there in Moscow right now, is to find some kind of a solution. Whether it's going to be a temporary ceasefire or a long-standing solution, we don't know that yet. But I think they both want to fix this relationship.
Alexander Nekrassov, irreconcilable differences, but war is unimaginable. That's why it's off the table. Is that what's happening here?
Well, we can see by the body language of the two leaders that they are determined to find some sort of a solution because the situation has got out of control. And this is unacceptable. Now, I think we should warn our viewers that this meeting will not really decide the final solution, in a sense that after this meeting, the aides and advisors, and especially the military, will start the negotiations on how exactly to implement this idea of a ceasefire or some sort of a restraint on what is going on. And I think the situation is so complicated because so many sides are involved, so many interests are at stake. And don't forget, some of the militias, you can't really control them properly, can you? You can say, for example, to the troops that you do this and that. But how do you talk to the militias? How do you tell them, that's it, stop? Because they never stop at once. So it's a very complicated situation. I do hope that two leaders, they found solutions before. They understand each other. I think they actually like each other. And I think that there is a way out, but I hope they find it.
What's fascinating to me is that it seemed as if, and this could be a problem with the translation, we don't have a full transcript yet. We had Vladimir Putin suggesting that, well, it was a mistake, right? The airstrike that killed 38 Turkish soldiers, it was a mistake. Whereas at the time, the Russians were saying, no, the Turkish soldiers were with jihadis in the Russian view. So that's fascinating if that's a walk back, and we'll unpack that as more information comes through. Let me ask this Syrian on the panel, Bassam Barabandi. Millions of lives at stake, whether it's people under bombs, whether people under siege, whether people on the move, heading towards Europe and elsewhere. Is this meeting as important as we think it is? Bassam?
It's important for short term, I think. Idlib is a very important issue for Syrian as a Syrian land, which had 3 million Syrian. And it's important for Turkey, for the ITPs and the refugees. Most importantly, it's very important for Turkey because Russia tried to destroy the credibility of Turkey. This is the key word. They hit the Turkish soldiers. They know the Turkish soldiers were there, regardless if they did it themselves or the regime. The air cover in Turkey is under Russian control. The Syrian, definitely, they hope that the conversation between the two presidents will cover all Syrian crisis. It's not only Idlib. There's a chance today. There is opportunity today that maybe the talk with two presidents will push the peace process, political process forward. Today, Turkey has kind support of the United States and the EU in very good position, very strong position, military on the ground. They proved that for the Russian that they don't care much about what Russia can do. And they proved to the world that they can revenge and they take the lead by their hands. So Turkey today have upper hand. I hope, as a Syrian, that President Erdogan will push Russia to have a solution for the whole crisis, not only Idlib. I think we have momentum here. I hope you will not miss it.
Mark Simakovsky, Turkey wants more American solidarity, more American help. Is it going to get it?
You know, I think Turkey is going to get rhetorical support from the United States, perhaps some small levels of intelligence and military assistance to the tune of ammunition, but nothing substantial that will either give Erdogan more leverage in his negotiations with Russia, nor give him more of a security blanket in terms of what Turkey really is asking for, which is both significant U.S. military support to the tune potentially of Patriot assets that would be deployed alongside the Turkish border, which would act potentially as a deterrent against Russian air forces. There has been clear reluctance in Washington, both because of ongoing frustration with Turkey over its acquisition of the S-400, and now Turkey turning to Washington for assistance and support. And of course, I think despite Ambassador Jeffrey's very noble mission to the border to showcase U.S. support for Turkey, there's clear divisions in Washington and divisions within the Department of Defense, where I formerly worked, about frustration with Turkey and whether it's in the U.S. interest to provide support. And the U.S., of course, has real limitations. The Patriot batteries are something that are in limited supply and to simply turn around and supply those capabilities, particularly as Turkey rebuffed the United States over the S-400, is highly unlikely. So in many ways, I think Erdogan, through this crisis, is still frustrated with the United States, and this is part of Putin's ambitions, is to use this crisis and the diplomacy surrounding Erdogan's visit to Moscow to showcase to Erdogan that he is the only one that's able to bring Turkey security in northern Syria, not the EU, not the United States, that in many ways Erdogan is even more isolated because of Russia's pressure on Turkey.
Emre Ersen, is that how the Turkish government sees it? Forget the Europeans, forget the Americans. This needs to get sorted out in Moscow with Putin because they are the game changer here.
Well, to an extent, that would be correct, but we also need to remember why Turkey is making all these moves regarding the refugees. There is definitely a Western dimension to it, and Turkish foreign policy in general is also situated in between Russia and the West in general, the EU and the United States. So in that regard, yes, because Russia is definitely the most powerful military actor in Syria, I think it means a lot for Erdogan to reach some kind of a solution with Putin in Moscow today. But on the other hand, we also need to keep in mind that Turkey also wants to continue the strategic relationship with the United States and the European Union, as also indicated by all these decisions taken in the last few years.
Yeah, to the refugee question here. What's interesting is that even some of the harshest critics of Turkish foreign policy, even if they say and claim that Turkey is using the refugee question cynically and opening the borders in order to sort of call Europe's bluff and so on, they're saying, well, it's about time Europe gets involved. So even the strong critics are saying, well, Turkey's doing the right thing here. And we're seeing the Europeans freaking out in many ways. They're holding emergency meetings. What are we going to do about the refugee crisis? These people are going to flood over the borders. So with that in mind, this happened just a few hours. This was announced just a few hours after the Turkish soldiers were killed. With that in mind, has the policy worked so far that the Europeans have sort of sat up and tried to do something about it?
Well, we get some messages about it. I mean, but we probably need some more time to understand whether this has really been effective on Europe. But I think the reason why Turkey decided to change this policy of opening the borders was mainly to exert more pressure on Russia. Because we need to keep in mind that as long as the Russian and the Assad regime's operations in Idlib continue, the refugee crisis will actually get worse, both for Turkey and for the European Union. So I think in that regard, on the one hand, yes, the idea is to exert more pressure on the European Union regarding the refugee crisis. But on the other hand, the main target of that pressure is also Russia, and to influence Russia to change its stance about the military operations in Idlib and to take the European Union's support in that.
Alexander Nekrassov, something that the US Special Representative for Syria, Ambassador James Jeffrey, said a few hours ago at Dolmabahce, just down the road from where we are here. He said something interesting. He said, we do not understand why the Russians continue to push Assad's agenda. And that's a question that's been asked by a lot of people. What's in it for Russia? Why do they have to back this guy who's responsible for such destruction to his country?
Well, you know, it's a complicated question because, you know, if we start talking about the role of Russia in Syria, we automatically look back at the role of NATO and America and the West in creating the crisis across the Middle East. Because we always sort of seem to be looking at these situations and cut off the previous years. So, you know, very quickly, Iraq, Libya, and other matters, they influenced the current situation. It was getting out of control across the whole of the Middle East. And I'm surprised, by the way, by people saying, what has Russia got to do with it, when Russia was worried by the whole situation in a region not very far from its southern borders getting out of control. We still remember what was going on in Syria, and people remember that by looking at Libya. Look at Libya, what happened there. That was a Western sort of idea of democracy imposing on it. And look at the country destroyed.
Okay,
look at Iraq.
So with that
look
in mind,
everywhere.
And I'm going to get a response from Bassam in a moment. But with that in mind, Emre Ersen has said that What Turkey is doing now, besides trying to pressure the Europeans, it's also to pressure the Russians. So on the ground, Turkey is trying to cripple Assad's air forces, right? Its air defenses and so on. His ability to rain barrel bombs on people in Idlib and so on with Russian help. And also, it's trying to push Russia to stop its support for Assad. With that in mind, is it going to stop Russia's support for Assad or limit Russia's support for Assad? Mr. Nekrassov?
Oh, sorry, I thought it was not
Oh,
me.
go ahead, no problem.
Yes, well, the point is here that Assad is trying to liberate the whole of the territory of his country. Now, when you say that Russia is pressing him, I don't know who is pressing whom here, but of course we have to accept one thing, that Russia has spent a lot of money and a lot of resources and had some casualties there, and it had to basically be seen domestically, and I think internationally as well, as completing the mission. The mission, unfortunately, has not been complete. Unfortunately, we have had Russian military saying, well, we're going to finish this off in a matter of months, and that was done 4 times, I think, that Russia was saying, well, that's it, we've done it, we're leaving, and it was not leaving. In a sense, Russia was sucked into this conflict, and we have to accept this. But to say that Russia is pressing Assad to liberate his own country, I mean, it sounds bizarre. So I think that we have to accept that the situation, the Syrian government has a role to play in its own country. So I think instead of propaganda, we had a lot of propaganda heard and used, even in news coverage, about this crisis. And that's why I think it's becoming very difficult to find some sort of solution when you have the American and Western media basically peddling propaganda. And unfortunately, some of the media outlets from other parts of the world picking up this propaganda as news.
Bassam
That's
Barabandi,
why it's
okay.
complicated.
Okay, Mr. Nekrassov. Okay, so let's bring in Bassam Barabandi. So Bassam, you know, Mr. Nekrassov, I gave him the opportunity to sort of spell it out because it's important to understand the foreign policy mindset when it comes to Russian influence in Syria. And he equates it. He says, well, yes, you have Russian influence in supporting Assad, but it's against the backdrop of American and NATO imperialism, and we do not want to see another Libya in Syria. That's why we're propping up Assad. As a Syrian, respond to that for me.
Yeah, actually, Putin, I think he have the same structure like Assad, governing structure. So for Putin and the Russian elites, if the people in Syria succeed in winning against Assad peacefully, he could be the next. So that's why they don't want this model of people movement to go into the street and overthrow the government, not any government like Assad government. So I think that was the best and the first motivation for Russia to intervene in Syria, because they don't want that model to continue and reach to them. When he mentioned Libya, today when you look about how many Syrian refugees under after Russian control, or after Russia interfered in Syria, how many Syrian IDPs and refugees went to Europe, and compare it to Libya. Libya as, I think, by thousands, in Syria by 100,000s. So I don't know which model, if I'm European, which model I prefer, Libya model or Syria model. Definitely Russia have big influence on Syria. I don't think they will succeed in achieving what they want. They talk about disinformation. Today, the Russian disinformation machine, they create thousands of accounts on Twitter using the Turkish names, Turkish slogans, in order to attack Turkey itself. Today, Russia, where the President Putin is meeting with President Erdogan, they just did massacres yesterday, and they killed in one of the IDP camps. So Russia is always trying to project itself as a powerful country, not by ideas and norms and values, rather than by military means. And they are using all that means in order to displace people to Europe and to get, like blackmailing Europe. If you don't pay for reconstruction of Syria, you will have more refugees going to your part, and we destabilize your areas. The very basic equation, we see it in Syria every day. If Russia was successful, if they have a model to success in Syria, I don't think we should have all this number of refugees going from Syria to Turkey to Europe. So I think all the previous speaker talks doesn't match the reality on the ground in Syria.
Mark Simakovsky.
And I'm sorry to say that.
Mark Simakovsky, why are we at this place right now? Is it the fruits? Is it the price of inaction over all of these years? Or too much action? Which one is it?
You know, I think what you're seeing is a great game of international politics and international interest from a range of powers, Russia, Turkey, the United States, Iran, playing out in Syria. It's no coincidence that after 9 years of conflict, you have several countries involved directly on the ground in Syria, and their interests, they believe, are threatened. The Syrian government's aims are clear. They're looking to clear out the last rebel stronghold, and with Russian support, despite a likely ceasefire that will take place in Moscow, the Syrian government will continue to squeeze the last redoubt in Idlib and will ultimately likely create another scenario several weeks or months from now where you see high-level diplomacy. That, I think, is inevitable. On the Russian side, they are going to continue to prioritize their relationship with Erdogan. They're not going to stop support for Syria because that has the ultimate aim of Russian intervention in Syria, which was to prop up and save the Assad regime, and they're going to continue along that path. That said, they're not going to give Assad a free hand. They understand they want to maintain and actually strengthen their relationship with Turkey. They know Erdogan is increasingly isolated, so Russia will continue to use its diplomacy to both benefit itself in establishing and strengthening ties with Turkey by maybe offering some sort of concessions and reasserting the 2018 Sochi ceasefire agreement, but they're also going to continue to warn Turkey that the end is near for Idlib and that it needs to understand that Russia will not be able to prevent the ultimate encirclement of Idlib. Now, of course, there are other interests at play. The United States, which effectively took itself out of the end game because of its withdrawal in northern Syria and isolation. You had U.S. forces within only 80 miles of Idlib that are now 500 miles away. So in many ways, Russia is going to define the end state because of its military power and its diplomacy on the ground and its ability to essentially push away the EU and Merkel and Macron and have direct diplomacy with Turkey. So I don't think this Moscow agreement is going to be the end, but we are going to see a temporary ceasefire that allows Erdogan to save face, allows Putin to be showcased as the prime international mediator that will define, and of course will allow Assad to say that he's going to continue his claims. It's not going to end the conflict. So in many ways, I think we're just delaying the inevitable.
Right. And so crucially, Bassam, amid all of this, especially as we have the sense of de-escalation from President Erdogan and President Putin, it means that Assad's future is not in question at this moment in time. Yes, his soldiers are dying in the battlefield, but the question of Assad going, that's not a question to be asked or answered right now. How do you feel about that?
Look, we always look about the dynamics among the international players like Russia, Iran, Turkey, United States, and others. But there's another dynamics, social dynamics within the regime itself. When Assad yesterday made an interview and he said, we have good relation with Turkey and we never did anything bad to Turkey, whereas his supporter and his constituent, they were looking forward to him to say, we will attack Turkey. Turkey destroyed most of his army in Idlib and humiliate them openly, and by video, YouTube, you saw everything. So his constituent and his army officer, I think they were expecting him to have more tough language, words towards Turkey, whereas he came the opposite. I don't think that makes things easy for him internally, within his own circles. So when we talk about all these big players, that's very true, but we always forget about the dynamics internally. Maybe today there is no Assad-based discussion between the two presidents, but that doesn't mean internally that people are not asking that questions, and they ask, is it smart or wise to follow the leadership of this guy who his army has been destroyed and he's replacing his enemy, and that thing is Turkey. So I think there's a lot of movable equations that we don't consider when we talk about the big game and we forget the small games.
Okay.
Russia always say that we are not staying with Assad.
Right. Emre Ersen, when Turkey sometimes is harshly critical and it says Assad, does it sometimes mean Russia, but it doesn't want to say Russia?
Yes, I think so. I mean, this is what really happened in this latest incident as well. I mean, for obvious reasons, the Turkish leaders don't really want to point their finger to Russia because they also want to continue these economic links and etc. But behind Assad, we all know that without the Russian support, Assad will not be able to survive. And I think we should also mention that right before the incident in Idlib, the intelligence of Turkey and the Assad regime were actually starting to have minor contacts with each other. So I don't think Turkey's problem at the time is only Assad. Yes, there are a lot of, I think, problems between the Turkish government and the Assad regime currently, but it is also obvious that for Turkey, there are much more important interests at stake. And there, Russia is definitely the key actor. So without pointing the finger to Russia, maybe it is much convenient for Turkey to deal with Assad. But in the end, I think it's going to be actually Putin which makes the final decision, and Turkey is aware of that.
Right, and Professor Ersen, Turkey seems to be trying to do two things simultaneously, and they're a very, very fine needle to thread here, right? On the one hand, to avenge the deaths of the Turkish soldiers, more than 38 by the latest count, Turkish soldiers killed by that airstrike without going to war with Russia, and also to force Europe to share the refugee burden without throwing the refugees to the wolves. Can it actually do both things?
Well, I think time will tell, but we should also remember that, as you remember, there were actually 4 de-escalation zones when Turkey, Russia, and Iran made these agreements. And one by one, Russia and the Assad regime occupied the 3 of them. So Idlib is the only thing that Turkey has now. And I think especially we should remember that because of the refugee problem, it also has significant domestic political implications for Turkey as well. And I think for the Turkish public in general, when you speak about the situation in Idlib, I don't think they really care that much about the strategic implications of the Idlib problem. It's mainly about the refugee crisis. So I think this is what the Turkish government is trying to do there. They have their red lines and they want to give this message to Russia that Idlib is our probably last red line. So there's no actually escape from Idlib for the Turkish government because they already stepped back to that line already.
Alexander Nekrassov, this will be manna from heaven for conspiracy theorists, but George Soros wrote an op-ed in Financial Times. The headline, Europe must stand with Turkey over Putin's war crimes in Syria. And he says, focusing on the refugee crisis Russia has created addresses symptoms, not the cause. Your response to Mr. Soros?
Right. Well, I know Mr. Soros is a huge authority on Russia and on the Middle East, but unfortunately I disagree with him, and I don't think that his views will be widely shared across the world. I think actually Soros is seen as one of the problems in this migration crisis, but we'll leave it at that. I think that there is a way to actually negotiate things, because people forget that there are several observation posts, Turkish observation posts, with about 100 Turkish soldiers at each, deeper inside the Idlib area, and nobody was hurt there. If you remember, I mean, no one, not a single Turkish serviceman was hurt or killed in those observation posts, which means that these agreements which were reached in Sochi and Ankara, they hold. Actually, even the militias never attacked them. And so I think there is a way out, in a sense, that some sort of a deal can be reached out, can be worked out in the Kremlin today. And I think that there is hope, at least for looking at that situation. But generally, I think that Turkey and Russia need to probably to agree with each other that the West and NATO will not interfere. They have so serious problems to cope for themselves. They have a financial crisis to deal with. So they really, really have to work it out together.
Okay. Gentlemen, I've got to wrap. Alexander Nekrassov, Bassam Barabandi, Mark Simakovsky, and Emre Ersen, Really good to talk to all of you. Looking forward to hearing what comes out of that meeting in Moscow. But that's all the time we have for now. Thank you very much for watching the Newsmakers. We will see you next time. Bye-bye.